guys, welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to be reacting to a video called I toured one of the best historical fashion museums in Europe. Super excited about this, no idea where that is, but we're going to find out, so let's check it out and comment, like and subscribe.
Royal Armoury in Stockholm, Sweden, as well as an art historian. And today she's going to show us around the museum, and it's the oldest museum in Sweden. And what year was it built in?
So this became a museum in 1628, and it's been a museum ever since.
Okay.
And it's moved locations, right? So the collection is really old, but the building itself, it wasn't always here.
Yeah, so now we are in the basement of the Royal Palace here in Stockholm, and we have been here in this particular location since 1978, but we have been a museum since 1628, and we've moved about 15 times since we became a museum, so a lot of locations.
A lot of locations.
It's
all right,
a lot of
let's
time.
go into the museum and see all the interesting things that are in there and explore all the little hidden gems.
Welcome. So the Swedish Royal Armoury is one of the oldest museums in the world. We have been a museum since 1628. We have one of the largest collections in the world of early modern clothing. We count about 40,000 items in our collections. Now, not all of that is clothing, but much of it is. And the things that we do have that are clothes, that collection includes some completely unique things that you just cannot find anywhere else.
Yeah, I imagine.
But before we dig into the actual collections in the museums and look at many of the textile things that we have that are so special, I'm going to explain what kind of museum this is, how it becomes a museum, and why it's not like many other museums today. This man right here, Gustavus Adolphus II, he was king of Sweden in the beginning of the 17th century. He is a descendant of Gustav Vasa, who many consider the sort of founding father of Sweden. And Gustavus Adolphus here, he inherits a throne, crown, and 3 separate wars. Now, one of these wars is against his own cousin called Sigismund. And while Sigismund calls himself king of Sweden, Gustavus Adolphus, he also calls himself king of Sweden, and so they two fight it out. During this conflict, Gustavus Adolphus is going to be injured on 2 separate occasions in the same year, 1627. And these 2 costumes that we have in front of us are the clothes that he wore when he sustained these 2 injuries. We can actually see the injuries still on this left costume, which he wore in the early summer of 1627. You have a bullet hole in the hip from a sort of surprise attack by Gustavus Adolphus and his soldiers. They were discovered. Shooting starts to happen towards this little boat that the king is in. He takes a bullet to the hip. He's carried off and patched up. Fortunately, he makes it through with just a little sort of flesh wound, if you will. But this second injury is much more serious. This is a gunshot wound that he sustains at the Battle of Dirschau. And you can see the blood that has sort of dribbled down the front of his buff coat here. The king takes a bullet to the neck. Apparently, it lodges itself between the shoulder blade and the bones in the actual spine. This is a near-death experience for Gustavus Adolphus, and you can see the sort of blood here. We also have several of the shirts that he wore under both of these costumes.
Oh my God!
The fact that Gustavus Adolphus survives this injury is seen as a sort of divine intervention, if you will, and so he makes the official decision to preserve these 2 costumes in the Royal Armoury, and that decision is made in March of 1628, and it explicitly reads that these costumes are to be preserved in the Royal Armoury for all eternity. And so they've been on display more or less ever since, and they're considered the sort of founding objects of this museum right here. They are not the oldest things we have in the museum. I think the oldest is a blade for a sword from the 12th century, but they are considered the inception of this collection as it stands today. And it has grown and changed a lot over the centuries since, but think of it as a sort of cult memorial to kings. Things have had different ways to these collections. Some things are absolutely what they sort of say on the box. Other things, probably not. So the research is ongoing all the time, and many items change information as we have more information about them as well. We have moved now to one of the costumes that are ordered for the wedding of Gustavus Adolphus.
It's really, like, the
and
brocade is
he marries in 1620 to a princess called Maria Eleonora of Brandenburg. And she is much more important than he is at that point. Her father and then brother is one of the electors of the Holy Roman Emperor. And Sweden at this point is a kind of, up-and-coming superpower. So it takes 4 years of negotiating for them to actually agree to marry Gustavus Adolphus. And he travels down incognito to Brandenburg to propose to Maria Leonora.
In
And he
that
does
costume?
this under a code name. The code name is G-A-R-S, and he calls himself Captain Gars. And you might wonder, okay, Gars, what does that mean? Well, it means Gustavus Adolphus Rex Svecia, so Gustavus Adolphus, the King of Sweden. Very incognito.
Yeah.
Everyone knows it's him, of course, and he shows up in this incredible costume made with Tyrian purple, silk, satin, and wool,
This is stunning.
embroidered all over with these fantastic fertility symbols of gold thread. So you have acorns and little flowers and all
incognito.
sorts of incredible iconography here with fertility and abundance in mind. And he shows up with this and proposes to Maria Leonora, and she just falls head over heels in love with Gustavus Adolphus. She's never seen a man like him before. I don't know if it would have worked on you, this particular costume. Maybe it would have worked on me, I don't know, but it definitely works on Maria Leonora. She can't eat when her husband isn't there. She can't sleep or breathe when he's not there. She is obsessed with him. He thinks that she's okay. Mostly. He's nowhere near as in love with her as she is
infatuated.
with him. So Maria Leonora is, of course, incredibly worried when Gustavus Adolphus goes off to war. And he is off at war almost all of the time. He is going to enter Sweden into this time's big conflict. And that is a war that at the time is just known as the German War, but that we today know as the 30 Years' War. And Gustavus Adolphus' decision to enter Sweden into this conflict,
they didn't know it was going to last 30 years.
is going to prolong the war by 18 years. So that has enormous consequences for all of Europe and for him, because he will die only 2 years after entering into this conflict.
Oh no!
And before he dies, he has sort of spun the propaganda machine in an ingenious way. He has proven himself to be an incredibly talented military commander, and this leads to him becoming one of the most famous individuals in all of Europe in his time. Many consider him the sort of father of modern warfare, and the items that we have in this display here are from Gustavus Adolphus' moment of death. They are, in a sense, relics for a Lutheran Protestant country. And what many Lutheran countries do in the 16th and 17th centuries is that countries that undergo a Reformation kind of replace the symbols of saints with the symbol of kings. So kings really sort of hammer home that message that you are to worship us now. And that was a very important identity for many people in this time as well. So the items here are taken from Gustavus Adolphus' body in battle as he fell in that same battle. And he dies in the Battle of Litzen, which took place on the 6th of November, 1632. And the most famous item that we have from this battle is, of course, the horse that we have in this display. This is the actual horse that Gustavus Adolphus rode when he was slain. It is an Oldenburger by the name of Streif, or Streif, as we call him today. Streif here, he survives as an artifact for a very simple reason, namely that he did not die at the Battle of Litzen. He survived the battle and came with the king's funerary procession all the way back up to Sweden. And that funerary procession took almost 2 years because, you know, it was the middle of winter, or he died in November, and you couldn't really drive through Denmark from central Germany the way you might do today. They really had to take their time to get the king's remains back after they'd been killed in battle. And Streif, he comes along and he survives for about 6 months after the king dies. And legend has it that after his owner died, he didn't want to eat or sleep for several months, and that's why he died. We have no real evidence that that's what actually happened. But as far as we do know, he is the second oldest taxidermied horse anywhere in the world. And he is our mascot. You can see him, this little pin here, and he is in our logo as well. The first descriptions of visitors coming to see Streif here, they date to 1644, so he has been on display for a very, very long time, and he has always been on display. Even though the museum collections have moved almost 15 times, he has always been up, and the only time he is put away is during the Second World War, when there were fears that Stockholm might be bombed, etc. And he is placed away in a hidden location. And when he is taken out again, all the newspapers are full of poems in his honor, and people are so happy that he's finally back. This is what we call the heart cloth. And after Gustavus Adolphus' death and his embalming, his heart has been removed from his chest and treated with different liquids and substances so that it will not rot away. This cloth is the very cloth that the king's heart was placed in. You can see the kind of shape of the trace of the heart. You imagine it as a sort of fist-sized and shaped object, wrapped in this as a sort of wrapping paper. And the story of this cloth is very sad. Maria Leonora, who is unbelievably in love with her husband Gustavus Adolphus, she cannot tolerate the passing of her husband. She actually isn't told of his death for almost 2 weeks after he dies, because people just don't know how she will react to it. She has actually traveled down to Germany to be near him on the front line, so she isn't far away. When she finally finds out that he has been killed, of course her entire world collapses and she begins to obsessively collect items that have belonged to her beloved Gustavus Adolphus. And the most gruesome thing that she chooses to save is the king's heart. She visits the church where his body is placed to lie in state, and she somehow gets hold of this heart that has been embalmed and placed in this cloth, and she carries this item with her for almost 2 years. Wherever she goes, she carries it with her. At night, she stores the king's heart on a little shelf next to her bed. She has it in this little fine metal box where she opens it and kisses and caresses and fondles the heart. She spends her waking hours with the king's body as they travel their way back up to Sweden. When courtiers ask her, you know, Your Majesty, what are you doing? Why are you holding on to the king's heart in a box like this? She says, why are you asking? If the king and I loved each other, then surely his heart belongs to me. And they have a hard time arguing that. And she is allowed to keep the king's heart for a long time. Eventually, however, she is made to give it back, and it is placed with the rest of the king's body for his burial in the Riddarholmen Cathedral in July of 1634. And he died in November 1632, so it's been quite a while. In
2 years,
this cloth, however, was not placed in the coffin with the king's body, so Maria Leonora gets to keep it for the rest of her life, and she does. The heart is placed in a little green fabric pouch and placed in the coffin, and we know that because the king's coffin was opened in 1832 for the 200-year jubilee of Gustavus Adolphus's death. But
it's so insane, like, how old it is at 1800s. It was like, oh, that happened like 200 years earlier. It's like crazy.
This cloth and many other of the items that Maria Leonora had preserved from Gustavus Adolphus, she keeps for the rest of her life. And on her death, more than 20 years after her husband, in her last will and testament, she leaves to the Royal Armoury Collections a big black wooden box. And in this wooden box, you find this cloth and many other of the items that she saved from her husband.
Literally,
and presumably, she was a very devout woman, so she probably assumed that they would meet again in heaven. These items, these mortal earthly remains of the king, well, she left them for us so that we could look at them, and she didn't need them anymore. And she, therefore, is one of the most important collectors in all of Swedish history, and she is responsible for some of the most emotionally charged and rare items in our collections. However, there's almost nothing from her. This collection is a carefully curated memorial collection that serves to perpetuate for eternity the memory of some individuals and some of their deeds. It is not a wardrobe, it is not a complete collection, so we have almost nothing from royal women up until, or sort of dating to before the mid-18th century. So before then, Maria Leonora and anyone of her status, it doesn't matter if you're queen, there's not going to be a lot of items in our collections from an individual like that, even though they are very important for preserving some of our most special artifacts. If we roll back the camera to before Gustavus Adolphus died, his and Maria Leonora's most important task was to have a lot of children. And they have several, but infant mortality is very high in this period. And for the 17th century, we usually say that about half of all children born die before they turn 10. So for Gustavus Adolphus and Maria Leonora, they only have one surviving child, and that is the girl in this portrait right here. Her name is Christina, and she is designated heir to her father's crown from about the age of 2, and when Gustavus Adolphus passes away, she becomes king. So she inherits the throne after Gustavus Adolphus's passing. She is only 6 years old when this happens. And of course, she doesn't have to do it all by herself. She has a very strong regency council, and they assist her with everything. And they also make sure to raise her as is worthy of a future king. The man behind us here in the portrait is called Axel Oxenstierna, and he is responsible for many of the reforms that build essentially the modern Swedish bureaucratic state. And he is in many ways a father figure to Kristina after her father's passing. Kristina, she is a very, very intelligent and stubborn young girl. She learns 9 languages. She develops a huge passion for history, rhetoric, philosophy. She becomes a practicing alchemist, for example. She is a libertine skeptic, a stoic, really a very interesting figure. She's also been the focus of a lot of research historically, and that all different time periods of researchers have tried to turn into different things. We know that Kristina gathers around her a sort of academy of intellectuals. The most famous example is, of course, the French philosopher René Descartes, who visits her in Sweden and then dies here in Stockholm.
Oh, really?
But she invites many other famous people here. For example, the French librarian Gabriel Naudet, who is considered the father of libraries. So she really is a very unique individual. And when these people come here and visit her, they just write home to their friends in amazement. They say, this young woman is incredible. She has seen everything. She has read everything. And she's never happier than when she gets to speak to us in her academy alone.
That's so nice.
You might think that Kristina doesn't take her responsibilities very seriously.
No, I think it's the opposite.
But research also shows that she is very involved in governing. I mean, no wonder, she is king. When Kristina is crowned in 1650, the archbishop, in placing the crown on her head, he says that nu är Kristina krönt till konung, hon och ingen annan. Now Kristina is crowned king, she and nobody else. One of the points of contention that people have discussed about Kristina for centuries at this point is her love life. She decides very early on, around the age of 12, 13, that she will never marry. She has a quick fling with her cousin, Charles Gustav, who she will then leave the throne to, but that never pans out into anything. And she also has what we think may have been some sort of romantic entanglement with one of her ladies-in-waiting, who is a beautiful young woman called Ebba Sparre. Kristina calls Ebba Sparre La Belle Comtesse, so the beautiful countess. She does these things where she gifts her lavish gifts and sort of praises her in all kinds of ways.
So
there are rumors, they circulate saying that, oh, you know, they share a bed at night, etc. That in itself isn't necessarily rare, and Kristina also arranges for her beloved to be married off to a nobleman. So they don't live together in any serious way, but we have letters suggesting that they were very, very fond of each other indeed. And unfortunately, the source material doesn't let us dig further into it, but there is probable evidence that Kristina had some sort of romantic entanglement with a woman. There is also evidence that Kristina had a long romantic entanglement with a cardinal later in her life, because what Kristina will do is that she will tire of her role in Sweden. She will have bigger plans for what she can do with the power that she has. And she will decide to abdicate. So she leaves her throne and she also converts to Catholicism. And remember, her father, Gustavus Adolphus, has been this sort of hero figure par excellence for the Protestant side in the 30 Years' War. So Kristina here, not only leaving her throne, but also converting and joining the other team, so to speak. That is an enormous scandal. And when she does that in 1654, she realizes that she is never again welcome back to Sweden. She will come back twice, but there's a lot of diplomacy happening around that, and people are very worried when she returns. When she leaves Sweden,
Where did
after
you
her
left?
abdication on the 6th of June 1654, she is going to immediately set sail for Brussels, where she will eventually convert, and she converts about a year and a half later, and she will eventually settle in Rome, where she becomes very close with the Pope, with several popes. Some of them she's not so friendly with, but she is a very important cultural patron and figure in the 17th century in Rome. Now, we've just looked at some items that we know a lot.
It's like I was a king and then I am doing this. Like, okay, good for you.
About, but other things in the collections we don't know as much about. This fantastic harlequin dress from the late 17th century is one such item. We do know that this is from the period. It is a 17th century dress. It is definitely a harlequin dress. And it has most likely been worn by Queen Ulrika Eleonora the Elder.
She was tiny.
That's about all we know. We can follow this in the inventories from about that period, but we don't know a lot about exactly when it would have been used.
Yeah, that's sad.
So we can only assume that it would have been worn by the queen, one of her ladies in waiting, or another woman at court for a big court masquerade or carousel or theater performance of some sort.
Something fun.
But this dress is a very good example of, well, the circular way that the early modern clothing economy would have worked. So you see that it's made up of all of these fantastic little silk pieces.
Yeah.
They are placed in like an even pattern. They sort of radiate out. So, of course, the immediate thing you notice then is that this would have been cut and patterned flat so that you can place these in like these nice shapes. And it also says something about how textiles were valuable and how they were reused just to infinity. You don't waste a single little scrap, but you make use of every little square inch of fabric that you have at your disposal.
And they were kings
In
and
fact,
queens.
the fact that a museum like the Royal Armoury exists at all is testament to the fact that everything else would have been used up. It's very common for us today to think that, you know, royalty through history, they just had clothes made and they wore them once or twice for a ball or whatever.
They threw it out.
But nothing in our archival material or our sources suggests that. As far as we can tell from these materials, things are reused, things are remade, things are patched up, taken in, put out. You know,
they're a harsh time for everyone.
To be able to be worn for as long as possible.
Yeah.
In order for things to be preserved, you need to make an actual institution and a museum to put them in. And even then, you have to prevent them from being taken out and used up for something else. So we know that in later periods, say in the 18th century, for example, they would have actually borrowed things from the Royal Armoury collections and remade them and refashioned them and used things up.
You can't do that!
It really is rare to have things surviving from this period at all.
Yes!
And we can only guess what these little like patchwork pieces came from. We have no idea what garments they would have been placed on or been part of originally.
Yeah.
Okay, we have jumped forward to one of the most exciting and special areas as far as these collections go. We are now in the middle of the 18th century and we are invited to a royal wedding. Things have changed a lot politically in Sweden and we still have a royal family in the 18th century, but we are in what historians and people at the time call the Age of Liberty. This means that the king and queen are mostly symbolic and have no real power. Instead, Sweden is ruled by a sort of proto-parliamentarian system, which mostly means that the nobility get to rule the roost. And parliament, they have chosen that the future king, who at this point in time is just a tiny little boy, he is going to get married. Who is he going to marry? Well, he's going to marry a 4-year-old princess. He is 5 and she is 4, so at least they're the same age. Hopefully they're going to live happily ever after. She happens to be the daughter of enemy number 1, namely the King of Denmark. So the future King of Sweden, Crown Prince Gustav, is going to marry a Danish princess by the name of Sophia Magdalena. And these are their wedding costumes, and as you can probably see, they don't marry right away. They're going to wait 15 very long years before they say yes to each other. During this long period of waiting for each other, they send letters back and forth, but they never meet. They see portraits of each other and get to know each other a little bit, but the time to meet is the time to get married. So she has all her stuff prepared. She has this incredibly lavish bridal trousseau prepared. prepared, and she travels to Stockholm with 38 coaches of beautiful clothes. She has a coffee service, she has a tea service, and she has a hot chocolate service set. So she is well prepared to host lots of tea parties. She also has a private library that she brings with her. And if you look at the titles that she brings with her in this library, you can start to tell that this is a young and very nervous, anxious and introverted girl that is taking a big leap onto a stage which she's going to have to act on for the rest of her life. One of the books that she brings with her is called How You, Through Breathing Exercises, Can Make It Through the Most Difficult Days of Your Life.
Oh my
Poor
God.
Sofia Magdalena here, she is not cut out for this work at all. She does her best to carry herself in these situations, to take the stage that she has been raised to do, that is her destiny to take. But she realizes after just a few hours, after meeting her future husband, Gustav here, that he is not going to be the kind of support that she needs because they have nothing in common.
Oh no.
Like we've said, she is shy, she's introverted, she doesn't like being the center of attention at all. But young Gustav here, he is extroverted, he loves the theater, he loves to be at the center of attention, and he loves power. In a few years, when he becomes king, he is going to really shake things up. He's going to perform a bloodless revolution and reintroduce royal autocracy in Sweden, but not yet. For now, he is still a very nervous boy who is about to get married to a complete stranger. And to make it even more difficult, Gustav here has a very domineering mother. Her name is Queen Lovisa Ulrika of Sweden. She is the younger sister of Frederick the Great of Prussia, and she doesn't like the system where the nobility have all the power at all. So she actually tries to stage a revolution, a coup d'etat, to seize royal autocracy.
Oh my God,
and this revolution fails miserably and doesn't pan out. But it means that she has raised her boy here as her sort of special golden child to continue and hopefully finish what she wasn't able to complete. But this also means that she's very present in young Gustav's life. And when Parliament decides that he is to marry Sofia Magdalena here, Lovisa Ulrika unleashes all of her wrath and all of her fury on Gustav and decides before this poor princess even enters the country that there's no way she can make it at the Swedish court. So as Gustav is traveling down to the coast to receive his new wife and meet her for the first time, his mother is sending him letters and writing to him that, oh, you know, my dear Gustav, I know that you're probably lost in love now and you've forgotten everything about your dear mother.
What an evil...
You have your new ugly Danish wife.
Yeah. Your mother-in-law.
Forget, my dear Gustav, who the woman in your life really is. And she will continue to be a thorn in the side for these two.
What an evil woman.
They have nothing in common to begin with, and it's not made any easier by the fact that they have a very, very present mother-in-law. Now, this mother-in-law is going to do everything she can to further these two from each other. And it's actually going to take 9 long years before these two consummate their marriage. It's going to take 12 years before they eventually have one single child. They're going to have 2 children, but the second child will die after only a few months. So they have one son and heir, and they place all their hopes with him. But after this son is born that everyone has waited for years, well, at this point, Gustav here has become king, Gustav III. He has performed a very successful revolution, or coup d'etat, where he has seized royal autocracy, but he hasn't let his mother be in on it. So she is very upset with him. And when the news of this young prince being born arrives, she is actually going to participate in spreading rumors all around the country that, sure, the queen has given birth to a son, but there's no way that her son is the father of that little baby. baby. And we know that this breaks Gustav's heart. Of course, it's his child. He has no reason to believe anything else. And we have heartbreaking letters from him to his mother on the occasion of his son's birth, where he writes to his mother that, how could you do this to me? I thought you loved me. I thought you always
were going to be on my side.
You've always been so close. What have I done to deserve to be treated like you are treating me right now?
This is heartbreaking.
You have destroyed the best day of my life. And he ends one of these letters by saying that, you know what, Mom? I am the world's happiest father because my little baby boy is finally here, but I'm the world's most heartbroken son because my mother is dead to me. While we can definitely agree that people who wore these would have had difficult lives with trauma of their own, we can also agree that they looked absolutely fantastic on their wedding day. And we know quite a lot about the suit that young Gustav here wore when he married Sophia Magdalena in November 1766. We know this because of surviving letters of him ordering the suit from the Swedish ambassador to Paris. Now, this man was called Gustav Philipp Kreutz. He was at the court in Paris with a very important task of keeping an eye on how everything fared and, you know, what are the latest fashions, what are the latest news from, you know, the capital of fashion, as Paris would have been at the time. We know that he asked for this costume. He described, you know, how much it can cost. The letter still survives. And he says that, can you please check what the French Dauphin wore, so the French crown prince wore when he got married about 20 years ago, or for his 2 weddings 20 years prior. And the thing he's after is, you know, did he wear normal costumes or did he wear sort of historicizing, formalized dress? Now, Gustav here, he chooses normal clothing, so a fashionable outfit, and he wants it to be as lavish and as spectacular as possible.
It's a real wedding.
Unfortunately, this eager young prince, in his wedding preparations, he forgets something very important in this order that he places with the French ambassador. What does he forget? Well, there isn't a single word in this entire letter that he writes about what size he is. He just says, hey, sort me out with some nice clothes to wear for my wedding. But he doesn't mention how tall he is. He doesn't give any measurements or any type of size. Now, of course, everything in this period is custom made.
Yeah, of course.
Even if you are poorer, if you can sew or you are near someone who can sew, you will have your clothes fitted to suit your particular body, and especially
they couldn't go to a store.
Prince, so you don't say, "Oh, I am a size medium," etc. But he could have mentioned something about how tall he was, or anything to help along. But he doesn't, and so Kreutz, he has to improvise. He goes to the finest embroidery firm in all of Paris called Leroux et Lasalle, and he commissions them to embroider this incredible 3-piece suit consisting of a waistcoat, coat, and breeches. The embroidered motif is done in gold sequins and a blued silver foil, and the motif for the embroidery is suns appearing behind the clearing clouds. And that's not a randomly chosen iconographical statement.
Of course not.
It was 64 years since a Swedish heir to the throne had last been born in the country when young Gustav here was born. So there were really some very big hopes for the future for this little king here. What does Kreutz do? Well, he orders these embroidered pieces and then he sends them to Sweden in a sort of flat pack with written instructions for how they are to be assembled on being received here. And that's exactly what they do. So we can actually see, if you look on the inside of this, that they've cut it apart and assembled it exactly according to the instructions that Kreutz wrote in his letter that came with the order. That's also why you have this applique going over the seams in the sleeves, so that you could cut a sleeve that fit perfectly without having to worry about destroying any of the embroidered pieces. Now we're going to talk about one of the most rare items in our collections, this fantastic robe de cour, or a grand habit, which would have been worn by Sophia Magdalena for her wedding in 1766.
Yeah, that was fashionable.
Now, we know quite a lot about this dress. It was brought with her as part of her bridal trousseau. She had about 10 dresses like this one, so very formal court gowns, and many other dresses, of course. But this is the only one that survives from the things that she brought with her. This isn't something that that she would have chosen to wear herself. We know that she was a very shy girl and she wouldn't have had much say in what to wear on her wedding day.
Yeah.
This is not a love match. This is not a fairy tale wedding at all. This is a very important, highly formalized and ritualized political event where two states meet and two individuals represent both their states and their dynasties and the future hope for those two nations. Now, Sophia Magdalena here, she is wearing a garment that is mandated by law for royal women in this period. And that, of course, makes it a sort of costume that women who marry and who are of a certain rank are expected to wear. And this is in 3 pieces, so it's technically not a dress. We have the boned bodice called the corps or the corps-baleine, and it's boned with long strips of baleen. If you take a photograph of this from inside, you would be able to see all the different strips. Also worth mentioning is that this dress in its entirety has been measured, and there is a pattern of it in the Patterns of Fashion book number 5, I think. And the second part of this dress is, of course, the underskirt. This is worn over panier or hoop skirt.
Yeah,
it looks, I won't say plain because this is still a silk and silver thread brocade, but it would have been more decorated when she wore it. And we have no surviving depictions of her in this dress, but we know from the...
I was about to say as well, it looks a little plain, especially, like, again, it doesn't have like the embroidered parts that the other has. So I was gonna say, like, it looks crazy, but it's kind of like a plainer looking gown, which is crazy to say.
Inventories that there would have been 114 flower bouquets sewn onto the skirt, and those flower bouquets were made of pure silver. And they were picked away and melted down after the wedding because there was a limit to how high a value you would be willing to store away in an armory collection like this.
Correct, yeah, I get it.
But the decision to save these and to put them away was made almost immediately after the wedding so that they were preserved for posterity. The third part is the train that's sort of hanging, and the train is a very ritualized and symbolic part of this outfit because part of the ceremonial that went with the whole wedding ceremony consisted of who got to carry the train, who got to do what with it. That means that you really need to understand this garment as a sort of chess piece. It's a prop that that makes part of a ceremonial that many people are part of and enact together. So think of this as a sort of set piece that enters into the ceremony where she represents not only herself and her wishes, but a lot more. Well, what she herself thought, we don't know. One of the most common comments about this is that perhaps she must have been very uncomfortable. And well, of course, this is not something that many of us would find comfortable today. I often want to remind visitors to this museum to consider how obsessed with comfort we as a culture are. We think about sweatpants, we have triple glazing in our homes, we have these big soft like couches and sofas to sink into, and our first thing to think about is always how comfortable is that? I mean, this is her wedding day. This is her wedding gown, and she is in a highly public, dynastically important moment in her and her nation's life. Whether she was comfortable or not was probably relatively low on her list of priorities. So when we look at this, it's easy for us to project our time and its values onto it, but we should probably try to think a little bit also about what it represented to her contemporaries and to the people who this would have been meant to symbolize something too. That's also
for yourself.
why we have such a wide skirt here, because in a pre-industrial era, before sewing machines, all clothing would have been handmade, and that means that how long something takes to make isn't necessarily a good way to signal status, because everything is industrialized. So more embroidery, etc., more hem to hem, that's not really what does it. But in a materially scarce society, well, of course, how much material you can afford is a very important way to
that's the status
what
symbol.
You are and who you are and what you can afford. Today, paying someone a wage to do something for you is the most expensive part of a purchase often. So hand-sewn shoes or handmade suits or tailor-fitted garments is very expensive. Whereas materials today, comparatively cheap. In the 18th century, It's
on what
the
you're
exact
using.
opposite. So all clothes are handmade. Everything takes a long time to make, but
Yeah.
wages are also incredibly low. But materials much harder to come by, and
Correct.
that's why you will show status by showing that you can afford a lot of material. And this is the epitome of that.
I have
moved forward a little
clothes.
bit in time. We just watched Gustav III get married and enter into a very unhappy marriage.
Is that a
And
masquerade?
he is going to inherit the throne and become king himself. And one of the first things that he does when he takes to the throne is that he performs a coup d'etat and seizes royal autocracy. The uniform behind me right there is the uniform that he wore on the day of his revolution, the 19th of August, 1772.
And was that the actual
But
outfit?
when he does this, he makes himself an enemy of the nobility. So among normal people, he's quite popular for his entire life. It's the nobles that don't like him because they had the power, more or less, and they lose it when
Yeah,
he
of course.
seizes autocracy.
I'm not gonna like you.
He's going to see himself as an enlightened despot, if you will, and he's going to enact and introduce many enlightened reforms. He introduces freedom of religion for foreigners in Sweden, for example. He removes the death penalty on things such as witchcraft. He introduces and founds many cultural establishments and institutions that remain active and important in this country to this day. So the Royal Academy of Music, the Royal Dramatic Theatre, and the Royal Opera, for example, and of course the Swedish Academy, which to this day elect the laureate in literature for the Nobel Prize.
Oh.
Gustav here makes himself an enemy of the nobility, and he is going to pay dearly. This king remains one of the most fascinating and researched figures in all of Swedish history. He is much discussed and debated and remains a polarizing and fascinating figure to this day. You really couldn't make up an ending like Gustav's here. He has a very controversial time as king where some people really like him, others really don't, and eventually a group of conspiring noblemen are going to conspire to murder the king, and they choose to do it in a highly public spectacle kind of way.
Oh my god,
They
that's so
shoot
dramatic.
the king at a masquerade ball at his own royal opera house. Now
So
we know quite
dramatic.
a lot about how this conspiracy unfolds, and the way it pans out is that the king is present at the masquerade ball. He is wearing this very costume, so these are the exact clothes that Gustav III wore on the night.
love them.
He is there with his friends. They're waiting to join the festivities when all of a sudden the king receives a letter of warning. And this letter of warning reads, "Your Majesty, please don't go to the opera ball tonight. There are people here who are here just to
Oh my
hurt
God.
you."
It's like the
so
Secret Service.
nicely written because it's of course one of these co-conspirators. He has gotten cold feet, and so he wants to warn the king. And he writes something along the lines of, "Nothing is so conducive to stabs in the back as night, like darkness and masquerade parties."
Oh, God,
He, of
they were
course,
so
receives
dramatic.
this letter, and we know from eyewitness accounts that he reads it and he remains silent for quite some time, and then he stands up in his little opera box and looks down on the audience who have started partying away, and stands completely still for several minutes and just looks at the audience, and then turns around to his friends and says, "This was a letter with a threat, and this moment right here would have been a good moment to shoot me if that's what you were here to do tonight." Then he says, "Come on,
Attention
friends,
for the
let's go
dramatics.
down to the party and try to have a little bit of fun at least."
You
And
can't make
he
it up. It looks like a
grabs one
film.
of his friends, Count von Essen, by the arm, and they make their way together around the stage, and they enter onto the stage from the back. The first thing that happens is that the king is surrounded by a group of masked assailants, one of whom is wearing the mask that is down here, and he is not alone. They're all wearing these long domino cloaks and identical masks, and
Literally
one
cloak
of
and
them
dagger.
is holding these two pistols right here. And with one of these two pistols, he shoots the king in the back. He immediately
In the
shouts,
back.
"Je suis blessé," I am injured, in French. And then he shouts, "Catch the man who did this, but don't hurt him," because Gustav here is very strongly against capital or corporeal punishment. What happens next is that the assailants, they shout that there's a fire so that people will escape, and there will be a tumult, and that they can just sort of disappear in the crowd and in the chaos. But quite soon, everyone present realizes that, there is no fire, but the king has been shot.
The king's dying.
The police master is actually present this evening, and he, in a stroke of genius, if you will, he says that, okay, nobody can leave the opera building without taking off their mask and telling us who they are. So they more or less compile a list of everyone who is present at the scene of the crime.
Like the FBI.
Now, the man who has held the gun, who is most likely a man called Jakob Johan Ankarström, who hated the king as of years back, he drops the guns and runs away. And the police find them.
Not suspicious
and
at all.
They will then take these two pistols and walk around to all of the different gunsmiths and weapon makers in Stockholm at this time, and they will knock on the door of every single one of them, and they will ask, do you know anything about these two pistols? Now, a few weeks prior, the assailants have handed these in and asked for them to be refurbished. The wooden parts are replaced so that they will work perfectly on the night of the important event. Unfortunately, they ask for a receipt in their own names. This is a mistake that they should not have made, because now, of course, when they arrive at the weapons manufacturer Kaufmann,
it's this guy, he lives there.
He immediately knows that, oh, well, those pistols, I fixed those up for a guy only 2 weeks ago. Let me run and fetch the receipt. What was his name again? And then, of course, they have the name of the person who would have paid for this. They walk over to him, they knock on his door, they say, please come with us. And they have at least the first person in this long line of co-conspirators who were involved in the assassination attempt on Gustav III. Now, over 150 people were involved. One of the other people who had a part to play in this was a nobleman called Mörner, and this little jar right here is actually one of our strangest items.
What on earth is that?
He hears that the police are on their way, and he decides to commit suicide. He knows that if he's caught, he's done for. So he swallows 2 spoons of arsenic and dies under extreme duress.
Okay.
Soon as the
Again, very
police arrive,
dramatic.
they say, well, you probably don't off yourself if you are innocent when you hear the police are on their way. So they open his stomach and save the contents as a part of the sort of legal process of proving his part in this conspiracy.
Okay, I get what they did.
This means
Still
that,
weird.
well, you can guess what's in this little jar right here. It is the stomach contents of said co-conspirator. It remains one of our most bizarre items in these collections.
It is.
We unfortunately don't know the extent of this conspiracy, because after about 2 weeks of suffering, this injury that Gustav sustains is, in modern terms, not a very serious injury. He takes a bullet to the lower back. If he had had this gunshot today, he would absolutely have survived.
Oh, no, he didn't.
In 1792, well, it doesn't really pan out like that. So he's eventually going to develop sepsis and
no antibiotics,
pneumonia, and after 13 days, he passes away as a result of these injuries.
He died.
However, one of the last decisions that Gustav III makes before he dies is to write himself into the history of the Royal Armoury. So you remember the costumes we saw right at the very beginning that Gustavus Adolphus II wore, and decided that they were going to be preserved in the Royal Armoury with the bullet holes and the blood stains for all eternity. Well, Gustav III here also loved those particular costumes, and he had ordered a beautiful wooden box to preserve them in. And one of the last decisions that he makes before he passes away is to say, please take Gustavus Adolphus's clothes out of that box and put my clothes in there instead. So Gustav here is a genius when it comes to writing his own name into Swedish history, and he does that in great part through preserving fantastic objects in the Royal Armoury collections. We have one of the world's finest collection of 18th century menswear thanks to his collection, and he really tried to write a sort of history about his own life through the costumes that he would have worn. So we have everything from his baptism costume to his coming of age costume, his wedding costume, his coronation costume.
Thinking about the future.
All the way up to, of course, the last and perhaps most important of the costumes he wore, namely this that he wore on the night when he was injured and received injuries that was later to take his life.
Yeah, he died.
We are now upstairs in the temporary exhibition here at the Royal Armoury called the Theatre King. And this exhibition is a joint venture between the Royal Armoury and the Royal Opera here in Sweden. And we are displaying things that in some cases have never been displayed before, and in other cases have not been displayed in a very long time. And up here we're focusing on the reign and rule of Gustav III, who we know very well now, and we're going to take a closer look at how he used the stage and clothing to really hammer home the message of what a good king should be. And in front of us here, we actually have his coronation costume. And I know that a lot of you watching this love historical reenactment, and so did Gustav. He loved to watch history more than anything else. So when he planned his own coronation, he actually decided that he was going to dress up in historical fashion. He was crowned in 1772 on May 29th, but the costume that he wore to be crowned was actually in a much earlier style. So he actually had it based off of a costume in the Royal Armoury worn by another king, Charles XI. Gustav here, he took a lot of inspiration from Charles XI, who had really performed the coup d'etat and seized autocracy for the king and the crown. And Gustav here was going to do the same just a few months after his coronation. So he dressed up as Charles XI and wore historical fashion for his own coronation. His queen, Sophia Magdalena, who you know now, she wore a robe de cour again, three-piece gown, just like the one we just saw. Actually, I think there are about 9 or 10 of these surviving in the world. And here at the Royal Armoury, we have 4. And 2 of them belong to Sophia Magdalena, and this is one of them. We also have the coronation costume of Gustav's mother, Lovisa Ulrika, who spread all those rumors about her son and grandson that we talked about previously. And we have the wedding costume of Gustav's sister-in-law, Elisabeth Charlotta, from her wedding in 1774. And that dress is on its way right now to be part of the big exhibition at the Victoria and Albert Museum about Marie Antoinette, so you'll be able to see that there. This robe de cour, however, was made in Sweden, and it has one of the longest trains of any dress we have in our collections. The train measures almost 6 meters, so very, very long. In preparation for his coronation, Gustav actually explicitly said that he wanted a low-cost kind of budget coronation. And by that, he didn't mean to actually cut costs, but he meant to spend money on Swedish-made things, as opposed to buying everything from France, for example, which is what they had done for the coronation 20 years prior, when his parents had been crowned king and queen in 1751. This means that he ordered this fabric from the Stockholm-based firm Ekstedt and Kolander, and they delivered 60 meters of fabric for the little tiny sum of a $27,000 copper coin, which in today's money is about 600,000 Swedish kroner. So very, very hefty sum.
But actually relatively cheap for kings and queens.
A very important part of life at court in this period. And Gustav III, he stages these incredibly elaborate jousts and carousels and different kinds of dramatized court spectacles.
He loved the dramatics.
Think of them kind of as massive, expensive, large-scale LARPs that the court has to take part in. And you can see in the picture here in the back, for example, one particular event that took place in 1779 called the Taking of the Galthair Rock. And the story is, as many other of these stories were, based on a sort of medieval myth or a romanticized idea of historical legend. And in the Taking of the Galthair Rock, you are in a country far, far away, a long, long time ago. And the story tells us of a beautiful queen called Briolani and how she is imprisoned up in a tower by her evil, scheming wizard uncle. And he locks her up in there to rot away. But fortunately, she happens to have caught the eye and attention of 2 very brave and dashing knights, Amadis and Esplandian, who are played by the king himself and his younger brother. other. And you can see them down here, how they join forces with their comrades to defeat the fire-breathing dragon. They make their way into the palace, go past all of these hoodlums and crooks and whatnot, and make their way into the tower and free the beautiful princess. We know quite a lot about this because the princess was played by the king's sister-in-law, Hedvig Elisabeth Charlotta, and she is a famous diarist in the 18th century. She writes in her diary of the story and the roles that everybody played and how the plot panned out. But she also says that while everyone else was down there fighting against fire-breathing dragons and having the time of their lives, she was unbelievably bored because she was stuck up in that cold, drafty tower the whole day. And after they had done this whole spectacle 2 times in a row, the king wanted to do it again.
She was like, no.
Unfortunately, the weather was so bad that they couldn't do it again. And she writes in her diary that nobody but the king was disappointed. These are for the court, so they're not open to the public, but it's basically everyone who matters has to take part in these. And often the story that they all play out together is about liberation. And instead of like Deus Ex Machina, you might talk about Deus Rex Machina, because usually the king steps in at the end to save the day. This was an incredibly good way for him to completely neutralize opposition at court. And him having all the courtiers and the people who might turn against him be too busy with playing medieval knights and defending fair maidens and jousting and whatnot, well, that's a great way to have them not be in their estates plotting against him. Remember, this is a king who performed a revolution and made himself autocratic at the expense of everyone else. And it's exactly the same thing as, say, what Louis XIV did in France, where he said to the entire court, come to Versailles, watch me do basic everyday things so that you're not somewhere else doing something that I might not like.
That's
exactly
smart.
The same thing. We have some surviving things from these carousels that are the only surviving examples of their kind. The best example is this costume behind me. This is a costume from a carousel called the Feast of Diana, where the goddess Diana challenges the king of the fauns to show that his faun brethren have what it takes to get to marry her beautiful forest nymphs. Now, the king of the fauns is called Nessus, and he is played by the king's younger brother, Duke Charles. And this is the exact costume that Duke Charles wore in this carousel. It is known in our inventories as the costume of a wild man. And you can see that he does look quite wild indeed. It's basically a loincloth with painted on leopard spots. It's a bear throw with tin claws that goes over his shoulders, and this lovely vine of oak leaves. And I want to make sure that you know that in the inventory, this is explicitly written as colored of flesh, so it's basically meant to be topless for a very, very pale and pasty 18th century prince.
Okay, so it was
this
like
is
nude.
Basically a Tarzan costume from the 18th century. It is the only surviving example of its kind, and it's never been on display before. So now that it's here, I hope it gets to live rent-free in your mind for the rest of your lives, because I can't
it definitely
no matter how hard I try, this is my favorite thing in all of our collections. So the things that we have seen here on the temporary exhibition on the top floor, they will be on display until the end of 2025, after which this exhibition is taken down and disappears and replaced by something else. But the things in the main exhibition on the bottom floor, they remain there, and you are very, very welcome to come visit the Royal Armoury here whenever you want. We are open most of the time. I also want to mention that this is a state-owned museum, so we technically have nothing to do with the Royal Court of Sweden today. But since this is a state-owned museum, we also have the expressed mission to put all our things online and make them as accessible as possible, and to conduct research on our collections. This means that our collections are mostly digitized, and you can go on our website and you can find loads of information about the things that we have in the collections here. You can find pictures. Any pictures we have of our items are free to use for whatever you would like. And if you have any further questions on anything in the collections or any of the things that you have seen today, you're very welcome to follow us on social media, where we're called Livrustkammaren, or send one of our curators creators or anyone in our team a message. You can find contact information on our website. Yeah, we're here to help, and you are more than welcome to come visit us. I'm so grateful to Vazi for giving me the time and opportunity to show this fantastic collection, which I personally believe should be much more well known all around the world.
Yes, I agree.
Because we really have one of the best collections of historical costume anywhere in the world. So I hope that you have enjoyed this tour around the museum and that you want to come and visit us here in the museum soon. Thank you. Bye.
Okay, this was awesome. If I could, I would like hop on a plane to Sweden and then I would watch this like in real time. In real life. It was crazy. I loved it. I know that I'll definitely get into like they mentioned it's digitalized and you can definitely go in there. I will definitely will. Obviously, seeing it live, it would be a different story. It looks crazy. I think like everyone should definitely do so. Like if I were in Sweden or if I were planning a trip to Sweden soon, I would go there. I love that the royal sort of like collection. That's like every single day of the year. Although that last one, I like, oh no, they should like leave it on for like quite a bit longer. But again, like all those like collections are constantly like moving around. So it's not like, no, you're just not gonna it's not gonna stay there for like 3 years. But I loved it. This was so incredibly interesting. I love all these stories. Like, and she also like how she narrated everything was incredible. I really got the sense of like, oh, I now know like who those people were. But like it's such a like how incredible like fashion and preserving like historical. It's not just like preserving your historical artifacts of like, I don't know, knives and swords and guns and stuff like that. Actually, clothes tell a story, and you can think of like, oh, you know, it's fashion, or I don't know, I don't really care much about this, but fashion and clothes like do really tell a story, and this is the perfect example of this, and why it's important to actually preserve them, and how it goes to show. And I think one of the greatest examples was the sort of like the wedding gown that I think was Sophia Magdalena, I think that was her name, how important it was. She was like, it's not about a wedding, like it was about what she represented. Like she represented the union of like these two people that were bound to get married when they were like 4 and 5 years old. And it's not just about like, oh, how comfortable it is, how pretty it is. Like, yeah, that's obviously besides it all of like, you can see like, wow, it's a stunning piece. Especially because we're not used to like this type of clothes in this day and age. But it's just like what represented, like the whole thing about the veil and, well, not the veil, the train, and who had to carry this, and the whole embroidery. Like it tells a story. It tells you something. It's not just there because, oh, it looked pretty, it looked nice. No, it's there for a reason. And also like, and again, like the representation of the union of these two parts of these two countries. And it was, again, like back in those days, like weddings were not just like, oh, we love each other, we like each other, we're gonna get married. No, of course not. And I think, you know, clothes really do show you that. And the gown, the piece that what the king wore, just as well, like the embroidered part was like, no, it tells a story. It was symbolic. Like everything tells you a story, especially back in those days, because you didn't, you know, how do you message this? And it's like, it's a symbol, and it's not like, well, I can't tell you. So how do you do that? Well, you embroider certain things, and then you go like, oh yeah, you know, and even the other, I think the other king, the first king, Gustav, they were both named like Gustavus or something of the sort. But he was like, yes, you know, it's gonna represent a lot of like blooming and a lot of like fertility symbols. The one that did the whole like incognito thing. So everything, like, yeah, everything represented a story. And I think it was sort of like, it's like a bygone era. Like we don't have that these days. Like you can obviously, you know, how you dress, I think represents like, especially like people, I know it represents like certain things, represents you, right? And you're like, oh, you know, it tells you, I'm going to tell you a story through my clothes, and it represents my personality. But that has been lost a little bit of like, you're not gonna, oh, I'm gonna embroider my life like motto into this shirt. Like, no, of course not. That's not something that we have these days. So I think it's been a little bit lost. It's just a matter of time. Obviously, like it would be impossible to actually do so right now. But I love that, again, back in that time period, like that was the case. So I loved it because it's like, oh, I this is so nice. I do have to say, like, all the clothes are so incredibly small. I know, you know, it's obviously, it's something that when you, and it's funny because I know that back in those days, like people were just like very tiny, as in like they were super small, they weren't tall, and they were like super thin because they were just like, they looked like they looked like kids. But it's funny that you sort of like, I know this, but every time I look at, like, I go to a museum or something and I see and when they have clothes and even furniture that actually like people back in those days were or used, you're like, wow, these people were like so incredibly small. They were so incredibly tiny that it's sort of like crazy to think. It's like they look like kids' clothes, and it's like, no, that was for a grown man, for an adult man, and it's like it's like 5 feet. Like what? Like this is crazy. The shoes are tiny. The shoes are like, I don't know. I guess it looks like a children's shoe. And even the horse looked small. I'm like, why? That was the king's horse? Like, it looked kind of small. I don't know much about horses, but like horses, I think tend to be like a little bit bigger, unless they're like a specific breed or like a pony. It wasn't like a pony, but I don't know. It's kind of small. I think the wildest story for me, that was the heart one. So surprised about the heart situation. The horse, like, well, sure, you're taxidermy, like the taxidermied horse. It's a whole other story. Sad, poor horse, but okay. However, like the horse, the heart is like, oh my god, this woman carried a heart. The heart wouldn't it rot? I don't know. I have so many questions, but again, I'm off to read this incredible video, amazing video, and then I'm off to read the whole thing about the museum, and hopefully like people can go, because if I were there, I would 100% would visit this. But that was it for today, and I'll see you next time. Bye.